They're all kind of dumb, aren't they? Genres, I mean. It feels like science fiction and fantasy are kind of just different skins of each other, and a part of me knows, of course they aren't. They have glaring similarities, archetypes, tropes, but they can also be very different, especially in the themes that they tackle. And visually as well. You see fantasy, you know fantasy. You see sci-fi. Despite having elements that could be considered exclusive, I still hold the sentiment of same difference. A thought I'm sure must have crossed your mind before. I think it's mostly due to the fact that fiction draws a lot of different things from a lot of different places. Not just SFF, genres in general get super blurry, but it can be especially so with the speculative elements, clashing violently and becoming so intertwined you can't tell where one starts and the other stops. It becomes a little hard to distinctively say, hey, this belongs here, yet you can still see the derivative elements of whatever it pulls from, where writers find their inspiration. And sources of inspiration can be incredibly diverse. Surprise, the people creating fiction are into a lot of different things. So it goes without saying, there are a lot of freaking genres. Like when you first learn about it, it leaves you wide-eyed at how deep it actually goes. Magical realism, military, steampunk, magepunk, fairy tale retellings, lit RPG, high fantasy, low, dark, urban, cozy, epic, and that's barely scratching the surface of fantasy specifically. Want me to keep going? I'm going to keep going. Portal fantasy, historical fantasy, how do you guys read this in public with a plain face fantasy, quest fantasy, sword and sorcery, power fantasy. Okay, I am doing a lot of setup, but what point exactly am I trying to make? Well, the different sources that inspire a piece, whether consciously or unconsciously, are a huge part of it, but it's more about the question, why do we classify into genres? I'm getting ahead of myself. What is genre in the first place? I did very light research, feel free to add footnotes, but apparently genre originated as a classification system for ancient Greek literature by Aristotle. Of course, it was ancient Greece, and I still plan to get more into it, but Aristotle's definition seemed like the beginning for what we understand to be genre today. Those elements of inspiration, repeated patterns, specific emotion, fantastical concepts, and conventions, they're going to attract writers and readers all the same. And that's ultimately what genre is. This one thing I like, here's more of it. So when I ask the question, why do we classify, it's really asking, why do we need specific catalogs of fiction stuff we love? Which is a much more fun and interesting question to answer. A very obvious answer, we enjoy it. From a purely consumption standpoint, fiction is amazing. It is relatable, inspiring, compelling, and of course we're going to have particular things we want to keep coming back for. That feeling, coming back for more, can go so deep we need another classification in tropes. Tropes aren't created strictly by reader preference. It could be real world lore, it could be history, mythos, but regardless, they get incredibly specific, like implausible fencing powers, or crouching more on hidden badass, precisely depicting a character who is chasing common sense in the opposite direction, but when, and only when the moment demands it, they become the most ass kicker to ever ass kick. But I digress. What about from a different standpoint? What is a writer's point of view on genre? Well, that's where I start to break down why I'm calling one of my favorite subgenres of speculative fiction dumb. According to Wikipedia, science fantasy is a hybrid genre within speculative fiction that simultaneously draws upon and combines tropes and elements from both science fiction and fantasy. So stories like Star Wars that have lightsabers and giant space megastructures, but also have the mysterious Force, Sith and Jedi. Sci-fi, fantasy, and the spaces in between, which is where Star Wars falls, leaning more towards sci-fi. But a lot of stories can actually fit in the in-between. Stories that are closer to either end still have elements from the other. I feel like I mention some arbitrary fictional spectrum every other video, but every time I do, I always mention how I haven't seen anything truly on either end of the spectrum, and that's mostly due to the diversity of fiction and its creation process. Again, it becomes hard to say this one thing definitively belongs here, because what does a purely fantastical story look like? That's not rhetorical. If you have any suggestions, I always love hearing them. But the spectrum contains sci-fi stories with tech that's far from plausible, much less possible, or stories that fantasy so hard it kind of becomes a science. So safe to say, pretty big ballpark, which is where subgenres come in. I've mentioned some science fantasy ones already, like magepunk, which if you've seen Arcane, I'm sure you're familiar with, or superhero fantasy with the popular Marvel and DC stuff, all of them with their own formulas and qualifications to be classified within that subgenre. And with the knowledge that people are aware of this, writers then look at genre, these fictional catalogs, as a way to understand what audiences engage with, exploring these patterns in an effort to gauge where they can align their writing thing, a fantastic marketing tool essentially, and a great analysis tool. There's a lot to be gained analytically as a writer from looking at genres. It's how we can do things like subversion. You can't subvert anything if expectations haven't been built up. And expectations can be self-contained in a piece of fiction, but a lot of it is also preconceived from just being familiar with the conventions of medium and genre. Oh gosh, medium is another can of worms that I'll probably open in another video. But should you subvert is the question. Should you follow genre conventions or pave your way? Should you tailor your work to what audiences are already known to like? Should you shy away from tropes and archetypes? Embrace these storytelling patterns that have been built upon for years and years, which brings me to the one simple point of this video. Write the story you want to write. Should I or shouldn't I is inconsequential. Regardless of reader preference or genre convention or whatever caused you to open a word processor and start clacking away on the keys, penning away on paper, there is a story begging to be on the page. Let it be. I will fully admit there is a case to be made for consciously pushing boundaries and actively trying to be original, and for the other side of writing directly to market, but I'm not the person to make that case. To me, genre will always be that analytical tool, to be fully aware of and acknowledge but never constrained to. Once more, writers pull from a lot of different places, causing fiction to imitate life, and life is not divided up into genres. It's a horrifying, romantic, tragic, comic, science fiction, cowboy detective novel. You know, with a bit of, if you're lucky. No, Alan Moore, I refuse to get this video demonetized. But remember, genre was created to categorize, meaning pieces of fiction already stood aside from it as their own thing. The first fantasy story was probably written to just simply be a story before anything else. However, there is also a discussion to be had about leaning into genre, about being aware of its strengths and how it can enhance the story you're trying to tell, especially for fantasy. That video is already live on my Patreon, which I just launched, by the way. My time right now is fragmented and an upload schedule clearly does not exist, though I don't think it ever will, but this is an effort towards rectifying that. I put a lot of work into this channel and I appreciate your support. You get early videos and probably some other perks later on. It's a win-win, come on. When the video after that is ready, that is when it will be up on YouTube, which means, I don't know. Again, I have a flawless schedule, so grab it early if you can. Thank you. Okay, bye. Also, I hope this is better. I am so sorry for the air raid previous video. I heard you all in the comments loud and clear. Some of you thought it was intentional, like what purpose would it serve?